Vladimir Putin claims his military is liberating Ukraine from the oppressive Western forces, but it seems more like he's liberating those citizens from running water. Just how is an infrastructure crisis hitting occupied Ukraine? Plus, we're going to talk about Russians getting rich on crypto and gold scams. Plus, of course, the head of a country has decided that instead of addressing their failing economy, it's better to just pretend that economic data doesn't exist. It's, well, not who you think it is. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about all of it. Okay. First story I want to take a look at is this one, in that Russian-occupied Donetsk and Mariupol are actually facing a severe water shortage. This is from actually just a few days ago. You can see here residents have to gather around a water truck, bringing their 5-gallon plastic bags or plastic containers in order to fill up household water allocation. Right? They say water trickles out of taps for only a few hours each day, and that is often discolored and undrinkable, right? That's because of a sustained loss of water pressure. If you've ever been in an area that has any level of loss of water pressure, they'll send out a boil water notice because, frankly, the thing that keeps foreign debris and bacteria out of the water is that if there is a penetration, the water forces its way out and nothing can easily get into the water pipes. But once pressure starts to diminish, likely because of, well, literally not enough water, you start to have exactly what they're experiencing. Foreign debris, bacteria, and all sorts of stuff get into the water. Now, of course, entire neighborhoods find themselves hauling water in buckets and collecting rainwater, which is sort of terrifying because, again, Ukraine is a middle-income country. Russia is a middle-income country. These are not countries in which citizens do these things. And it's not just sort of bad for the citizens and the residents. It's absolutely a terrible economic policy, right? Because you have to think that if you have to spend hours a day collecting water in buckets and rainwater, what you can't do is any other meaningful economic activity, which, remember, a lot of these regions have been destroyed in the war, well, by the Russians. And so pro-Kremlin bloggers and military propagandists in Russia are even at this point admitting that Donetsk had not had a stable water supply in nearly 3 years. They say water is only restored every 3 days, sometimes less. They say even that they only have running water every other day, but this timeline is often not followed. And in both cities, water pressure is so poor, it doesn't even reach the upper floors of residential buildings. Households have to rely on improvised wells, which is code for digging holes in the ground, truck deliveries, or just simply plastic tanks scattered throughout neighborhoods. And of course, many of these tanks turn green with algae, meaning that, again, not only do they have to go collect the water, but then they have to sterilize it, boil it, or treat it in order to make it potable. And the insane part is that Russia has made sort of its own, staked out its claim that it was going to fix this water crisis that's been brewing for a long time by building what they called the Donbas water conduit, a pipe system meant to bring water from the Don River near the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don. And it was completed in 2023 that was supposed to solve the water problems. But thanks to graft and corruption in the Russian government, the project never really actually delivered, water. In fact, Ivanov was arrested a few months ago for accepting massive bribes, including from the company that built the pipeline. Remember, those $1 billion of stolen funds from this pipeline project were probably what should have gone to actually build the project. I mean, literally, if you give me $1 billion, I will build you a pipe that takes water from an already flowing river into another region. It's really not that complicated. So the thing that I think is the takeaway here is that not only is this a sign of kind of the economic collapse, but remember, these are the building blocks of a future rebuild. If Russia had this ambition when it invaded Ukraine, that it was going to simply sweep out the old government, install a new government, and get in exchange something that was a huge prize for Vladimir Putin: the breadbasket of Central Asia, the industrial heartland of Ukraine, a friendly government that would do Putin's bidding, and it was going to have this economically productive population. And the reality of the conflict is such that instead he's now got what appears to be an economic basket case, right? Literally, populations, the military age men in these regions have all been drafted. There is no military age man left to fight. And so you've gutted your most productive workers and killed them off. Next, you've destroyed the infrastructure so that people, instead of even rebuilding the industry of these regions, they instead are becoming dependent on government handouts, these sort of water projects, and they have to spend hours and hours a day instead of, again, restoring destroyed buildings or, God forbid, actually restoring industrial production. Instead, they're standing in line or digging improvised wells. This is a downward spiral of an economy, right? It's literally taking what was a middle income country and then pushing it down the economic ladder so that now the day-to-day lives of these citizens look more like those in a developing nation, in an African nation, in which huge portions of their economic activity is dedicated to basic survival tasks like obtaining potable water or obtaining food. It's a huge disaster. But you know what's not a disaster? The metropolitan Russian economy. We've talked about this, that insulating the Russians' world from the war is an essential part of what Vladimir Putin is doing. So much so that for the first time, he has actually publicly begun to talk about or disclose in, again, staged, managed, recorded, quote, meetings, unquote, the Russian use of gold, cryptocurrency, and something called, and a technique called netting, in order to circumvent Western sanctions. Now, we've talked about the fact that Western sanctions, as time has gone on, have become less and less effective. But what's sort of scary is that we're seeing Russia build out an actually effective payment system between one of the world's 20 largest economies in Russia. And it's facilitating almost all transactions using these non-SWIFT payment methods. And what's crucial is that they are not denominated in the US dollar. Now, here's the thing to remember with why do people love the dollar so much for international transactions? Well, the answer is that it takes a lot to break the dollar's relative stability, right? Let's look at, for example, the ruble USD exchange rate. And then we'll look at USD to a basket of currencies, right? So I want to show you, right, the dollar index, okay? So here's the dollar index. This is over a day. Show me oh my God, what'd you do? Pop-ups. Here you go. Here's a 3-year chart. You can see that at its peak, the dollar against sort of an average of all world currencies is the best way to think of this. Dollar at its height in 2022, right, was about 112. Was 112 against this generic currency, and now it's down to a paltry 98. So we're talking about a swing of we're gonna say 10, maybe 15%, not quite 15%, maybe 10% over the span of years, right? And that's from its highest to its lowest point. It's a lot, but that's actually not that much. When you look at, for example, the ruble, here is the ruble stability. You can see, actually, let's switch it. Let's do USD ruble exchange rate. There you go. This is easier to understand, right? You can see that if you are trying to facilitate a large transaction in rubles, you could have it be as much as 133 per dollar and as little as 57 per dollar. You're talking about swings not of 10 or 15%. You're talking about swings of literally 150%. Even if you exclude that, even if you look just at the last couple of years, you're looking at highs of nearly just about, let's see, the high is just about cresting 105, right? And a kind of local low, it puts it at 78. So you're still seeing, again, 25, 30% swings. And this is why people love the US dollar, is because not only is it stable, but remember, let's say you were transacting multiple billions of dollars in goods and services. Not uncommon when you're signing a contract, for example, for a year's worth of oil from Russian state refineries. If you tried to do that in, let's say, Zimbabwean dollars or some other small niche currency, even a relatively stable one like Swiss francs, $1 billion transaction in Swiss francs is going to blow out the actual market. It's like saying that the price of eggs in your grocery store will go up if you try to order 1 million eggs from your local grocery store, okay? They're going to charge you more because it's an impossible order. In fact, the price of eggs probably in your state will go up because you have just simply ordered so many of them. So the US dollar doesn't have that problem. But Russia found itself with another problem. It can't use the US dollar. It was banned from SWIFT. So what do they do as an alternative. And this is sort of the Russian system. In fact, tons of not just Russian bankers, but bankers, cryptocurrencies, gold transactions, and again, banks doing something called netting through what they call verified agents have actually managed to balance transactions. So what have they been doing? Well, they've been going to the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Asia more generally to find things like gold and cryptocurrency exchanges, right? And what these do is they allowed the transactions relatively quickly. Gold functions as US dollar. It's a lot of countries have gold reserves, and the price of gold has not been super stable, but it's been stable enough, right? So we could see price of gold per ounce here. You look it up. You're looking at gold per ounce. Let's see if we can find the last 3 days. Let's do the last 5 years. No, if I get one more pop-up, I'm going to scream. Okay, you can see gold is not super stable, right? In fact, it's doubled since 2022. Here it is at 18, and now it's floating around 34. But, that's a pretty big swing, but you can see it's enjoyed actually a pretty decent level of international transactional stability, right? It's not spectacular, but it's still somewhat improved from the ruble. Again, in the same time frame, you're looking at, again, a something in the range of 130 to as low as 63. So you're looking at, again, swings that are just pretty massive and pretty inconsistent. Gold, it's better. It's not great, but it's better. But the cryptocurrencies, that's the real deal, right? Because oftentimes they are pegged to the dollar without actually being the dollar. And so that's what Russia has increasingly relied on. The issue is, of course, and as we can see here, this is we have a press release from the U.S. Treasury who's trying to pin down some of these crypto exchanges, but it's not clear that they can. For example, they pinned down a couple, one called PM2BTC, another one called, let's see if we can find it here, Cryptex. And when you see the numbers, you're going to understand just how massive this operation is. In fact, Cryptex is associated, they said, with 720, nearly $1 billion US dollars of transactions used, as they say, by Russian ransomware actors and cyber criminals, fraud shops, mixing services, and exchanges lacking know your customer programs, and a virtual currency exchange called Garantex. So all this to say, mixing services, right, fraud shops, these are all sanctions evasion. In fact, they literally say it, that these exist solely to facilitate Russian illicit transactions. And this isn't just Russia buying national security stuff, right? Weapons and whatnot from other countries. This is also about Russia simply being able to facilitate the regular sort of, for Russian importers to buy Chinese washing machines, right? Because again, it's about insulating their country. Because if they fail to insulate their countries from the Russian public from the war, the whole of Russia, that water crisis and food crisis in Donetsk, it's going to spread as more and more of the world of imported goods and essential services become unaffordable to Russians. And so these sort of these transactions are the way Russia's doing it. The other trick Russia's using is something called netting. And netting is very simple. Because again, as we talked about, huge purchases and sales of a currency are going to blow its stability out of the water. But what if, let's say, for example, there were only two parties in a transaction, in a currency transaction, right? There were 100 different Russian importers. They bought washing machines from China. They bought Chinese food. They bought Chinese drones that would get converted for military use. And to do that, they all have rubles, and they all use those rubles to buy Chinese yuan. But then there's a Chinese firm that says, I want to buy Russian oil. So I'm going to go on the market, and I'm going to sell you yuan, and I'm going to buy rubles. Because again, if you want to buy Russian oil, you need a Russian currency to purchase it. Well, some netting is when those banks say, listen, guys, we got a branch in Russia, and we got a branch in China. And when the oil company and the washing machine importers, they're doing the same transaction. Why don't we just see what the net difference is? And you guys will simply, we won't exchange all the yuan for rubles to buy all the oil and all the rubles for yuan to buy all the washing machines. We'll just say, what's the net difference between the two? And that is all we'll transact. And sometimes that can be incredibly small, right? If the balance of payments between the countries is sufficient. So what that can do is allow them to transact, again, in things like gold or less stable cryptocurrencies, because the transaction volume isn't actually that great. And I think that is one of the keys here that makes this whole thing possible. And it's one of the things that I think we need to acknowledge in this war is that this is as much an economic war as it is a military one. And the Russian state is very good at circumventing sanctions. They are very good at finding alternatives to insulate the Russian public and ensure they have things like consumer goods and remain sort of hidden away from the war's worst effects. And it's telling and troubling that you're seeing more and more in places like occupied Ukraine, in places like Rostov-on-Don. You're seeing the war sort of creep into ways that don't make sense. We're seeing the collapse of Russian civilian manufacturing industries. So the war is steadily closing in on the Russian public and crucially Russian oligarchs on whom Putin depends for his stability. But Putin is a survivor and he's always sort of found ways to sort of get around it, as we're seeing here. But it's not going to last forever. And we know this because the Russian state is increasingly not relying on assuaging the Russian public. Increasingly, we're seeing them rely on simply concealing reality, pretending that bad economic data doesn't exist. But before we talk about that, I want to mention, guys, that if you're interested in getting access to uncensored combat videos and, more importantly, supporting the channel, Combat Vet News is the place. You guys know that all these members get access to the members-only videos twice a week, plus an archive of uncensored combat videos, plus you can sign up as lieutenant tier, colonel tier, get access, drop me questions for my Q&A, get access to the Q&A, get the shout outs. You guys know the deal. The link is in the description. You should also consider donating to the Ukraine Aid Ops latest charity. We're protecting Ukrainian units from fiber optic drones. You can see we are so close to our goal of $200,000, and every single dollar that we raise is going to give the Ukrainians the netting, the mobility, the counter drones that they need to stay safe, right? I can tell you definitively, already deliveries are being made. Already soldiers are reaching back to UAO and saying, listen, that netting, that quad bike you gave me, they kept me safe. Soldiers have come home because of you guys stepping up. So thanks to all you guys that have. The link to that also going to be in the description. Okay. So let's talk about economic data, because economic data is one of those things that is a little unique because it is both a reflection of reality and a creator of it. Okay. So Russia has recently limited access to key economic and demographic data amid downturn concerns. They're trying to hide the fact their country is, in all likelihood, currently in a recession. And core government statistics, these are things like the CPI, the employment rate, crime and incarceration data. All of these things help sort of paint a picture for banks about the state of the economy. And this is according to analysts at actually a state-owned Russian bank. The escalation says that Vladimir Putin, right, has said, listen, Russia's going to avoid a recession. Well, the only way at this point to avoid a recession is to simply, if you never release GDP data, you'll never actually have a recession because no one can prove a recession is happening. And Rosstat, of course, is the Russia's version of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Rosstat, withholding several key macroeconomic figures for June in the first half of 2025. Among missing data were inflation-adjusted retail and wholesale trade figures, right? A sign of how much consumers are actually spending. Rosstat said there was a year-on-year 12% rise in retail, but they didn't actually adjust for inflation. And the analysts think it might be closer to 2 to 3%, which again implies that we don't actually know what the inflation rate is. But notably, remember, the official Russian statistics, the official Russian, policy position, they've said that inflation is down to just 4%. but this is not possible, right? If you have a 12% nominal rise in retail turnover, and that they say the real growth number after adjusting for inflation might be 2 to 3%, well, that implies a 10% inflation rate, which is a problem because that is twice the inflation rate that the official Russian government says. And in fact, the Russian government says inflation is so under control, they begun cutting rates. But if you cut rates while inflation is still rampant, you're going to supercharge inflation. It's like giving someone steroids when they have a huge tumor. You're going to supercharge it, okay? So the fact that Russia is hiding this data, including trade data, right? Again, Rosstat said there was a nominal 0.4% increase, but PSB said real turnover could be as much as 10%. These are huge problems, right? There is no real GDP figures. Why, right? And this is the problem. On one hand, it's just embarrassing for the Russian economy. But the average Russian, right? They pay prices, they have friends, they talk to people, they see, right? The economy is just the economic activity around you. And so the average person sees what happens. So why is it important to hide this economic data for Vladimir Putin? The answer is why these analysts at this bank care about this data. It's because they use it to try to forecast the economy of the future. They look and say, what is the next quarter? What is the next 4 quarters going to look like? Right? And just like your own household, let's say you believe there was an 80% chance a recession was coming. What would you do? Well, you would cut your spending now because you'd want to have a big safety cushion in terms of your personal savings, right? In case you lose your job or in case you have a salary cut, right? You would also do things like be less likely to take out loans, right? And you would definitely, if you're a bank, you'd be less likely to loan someone money because you need that money. And so all of these things, but all of those behaviors you notice, they would actually cause a recession. If every household were to spend less money, right? Just put more money under the mattress, so to speak, put less money out into the economy, was to expect an economic slowdown, reduce consumption, right? Again, if you say, listen, we're only going to buy bread once a week instead of twice a week now, and if everyone in the neighborhood starts doing that, the baker will go out of business. The recession everyone thinks will come. So by hiding that data, you're actually the Russian thinking is to say, well, we're going to hopefully stave off a recession because the banks won't start to behave as though a recession is here. But what is scary about this, and it's the same thing that's scary about our president doing the same thing, who's recently fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics for claiming to have rigged the job figures. Now, this obviously is just stupid because it seems kind of dumb to rig the monthly jobs figures. Again, here we are, 6 to 8 months into the presidency. So the first 5 times, not rigged at all. Then this time it's rigged, like you've just rigged it randomly for some reason. So he says, it's just to make me look bad, which of course doesn't make any sense, right? And the reality is that these figures from the Bureau of Labor Statistics said that employers added way less jobs in July. The agency thought that there were very little job growth in July, or at least below expectations by quite a bit. The agency, Bureau of Labor Statistics, also said that in May and June, they thought there had been a $250,000 new jobs added. They found, in fact, it was not the case. There were far fewer jobs added. And so Trump has said, listen, I think it's just easier. I'm just going to fire you. And it's implied that he will fire anyone because he says anyone who doesn't rig the jobs report against me, i.e. report true facts and data, right? Now, they said it was the largest downward revision in employment figures apart from the COVID era. Now, right, I want to point out that here is actually a graphical representation of all the times that the BLS has revised figures downward. And bear in mind, of course, that downward revisions are generally, they're going to be larger in scale as the U.S. population grows. So we have, I think added something like 50 million new human beings to the United States since '08. So you're going to see the total number of people employed also, like the swings will be greater. Again, It's like having a lot of money invested in the stock market. If you have $1 million invested, one day of trading you could see $100,000 of gain or loss, right? So you can see that it's not at all uncommon to see hundreds of thousands of jobs swing in one direction or another. Again, notably, you can see it happening multiple times during the COVID pandemic. In fact, it seemed to whiplash as they said, well, it's actually really bad. No, actually, we think it's good. We think it's bad. We think it's good. And the reality is that this is just how economic data works. You issue surveys, you make your best estimates, and then the data gets better as time goes on. You make your best guess. And the BLS has said, listen, we're committed to making our best guess here because firms find it so valuable to get that first crack at the estimate. So why is it important for Trump to fire this person? Well, the answer is, again, that if more data starts to roll out, one, I think he legitimately believes that it's just meant to make him look bad because that's sort of how he views the world. But I think more significant is that he doesn't want, because the jobs report, regardless of what it says, the jobs situation is still going to be real. And again, we Americans, we've got friends, we've got family. We don't need a jobs report to tell us about the world that we live in, right? But the jobs report feeds every other bank, every company's estimate of their world in the future, and they prepare for that world in the future, oftentimes by bringing it into being. Again, they're going to prepare for a recession if they continue to hear that employment is down, right? So the fact that Russia has increasingly relied on this same sort of tool in the toolkit to hide bad economic data is an effort to buy essentially time. That's all they're trying to get here is more time to take to stabilize their economy, to find some kind of solution. But as we talk about, reporting data collection is helpful because if you can see a recession coming, again, if you, just like your household, right? Let's say you see the recession coming, you save a big nest egg, you don't take out many loans, and lo and behold, the recession comes, you lose your job, but you're able to keep your mortgage, you're able to keep your car payment, you're able to sustain and feed your family, and you get another job. Maybe you make a little less, but that's okay. Between your smaller salary and your savings, you're able to get by for 12 months, 18 months until things are stable again, right? That's bad, but it's not a disaster. Now, what happens if you didn't know there was a recession coming? You got blindsided by it, '08 style. Well, then in that scenario, you not only lose your job, but then you can't pay your mortgage. You lose your house. So remember, that bank that holds your mortgage, they've just lost an income stream. In fact, they've lost hundreds, possibly thousands of income streams that they were counting on to actually pay back, to hold their deposits. Suddenly, that bank is looking insolvent. And you have an '08 type situation. That's what made it so dangerous, is because it wasn't forecasted. People really believed that there was a large that the economy was thriving, was in no danger, when in reality, it was barreling off a cliff. And by the time people realized it, the train had gone over the edge. And the fear is that for Russia, by not giving firms and individuals the knowledge they need to prepare, to mitigate the issues, and this is the risk in the United States too, is that by making firms unable to apply the brakes, right? It's one thing to have to say, listen, the track is out, we got to pull the brakes on the train. Yeah, your load's not going to get to the station in time, but if you go off the edge of the track, there is no load left. The train is gone, right? So that's the difference between a recession and a depression. It's one of the reasons that we haven't seen a true depression in this country since the 30s, is because the science of statistics, the science of forecasting, the ability of firms to read the tea leaves and figure out what's happening allows them to prepare, them and households to prepare for the eventuality of a slowing economy, which is a natural part of the cycle. We also have a more active Federal Reserve that can adjust monetary policy, again, ahead of these real cycles. But when you start to blind people, when you gouge the eyes out of firms and policymakers, what you end up with is a train conductor who can't even tell you if the track is out. You just have to hope. And, well, you only find out that you've gone over the edge when you hit the ground. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you to the Combat Event News members like Tom Anderson, Dan Cochran, Jalen Guy, Officer Murley, Deborah Oppenheimer, Paul JW, Jeff Davies, Mike 54, Citrine Margaret, GMAT Club, all of our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do it without all you guys, and I will catch each and every one of you in the next one. Cheers. Hit that subscribe button.